Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the HUD OCIO Learning Session. I'm Dr. Melanie Cohen, and I want to welcome you all to our first session of 2015. We have a really terrific topic today. We're going to be focusing on trust, trustworthy leadership. And in today's organization, I really don't know of a topic that's really more important than trust. We've got two experts with us today. We have Bill Benner. Bill leads his own company. It's called WW Consulting, Inc. And what he does is that he consults on human capital issues, executive coaching, and trust. We also have with us Brenda Depew. Brenda also is the owner of her own company. It's called Depew HR Associates. She has had a long career in the federal government where she has actually trained over 5,000 executives in leadership competencies. So what I'd like to do first, before I as you know, when you watch, you know I easily jump in with questions, but what I'd like to do first is turn it over to Bill, and we'll start talking a little bit about trust, and then we'll start getting into the intricacies of how do you really gain, build, and restore trust in an organization once it's lost. So Bill,
Great.
With that.
Thank you very much, Melanie. It's great to be here with both of you for the session today. I've had the opportunity to work with Melanie on a couple of occasions, so it's really fantastic to continue this conversation. We've talked a lot about this in the past. I think some of the things that we'd like to try to address today would be, is there a leadership crisis in business and government? And I think most of us would probably say yes to that, answer yes to that. We hear more about distrust than we do trust these days. Also, we'd like to talk a little bit during the session today. I know Brenda wants to talk about executive core qualifications and something from her business that's called Leading from the Center, which deals with respect, trust, and credibility. So it all these things tie together, obviously. And then also, time permitting, I'd like to talk a little bit about distinctions of trustworthy behavior. What are those things? How can we measure ourselves and sort of do our own self-trust assessment, right? And then the fact that this is an individual and collective responsibility that we have around trust. So those are some of the main themes I think that we want to address today.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. Well, why don't we start getting into some of the discussion? Why don't you kind of lead off and give us a sense of what trust is really all about? Okay,
well, relative to the issue or the topic of crisis and trust, why it matters, there's a company called the Edelman Company, which is one of the largest public relations companies in the world. They do a lot of research on around a variety of topics, and they have what they call the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it shows that there's a serious crisis of confidence in leaders of both business and government today. In fact, if you look at the trend lines since over the last 5 to 10 years, you'll see that it moves up and down a little bit, depending on the circumstances that apply each year, things that happen. But for the most part, public is basically saying their trust in leadership is between 40–50% or maybe even lower at times. Business typically scores a little bit higher than government. However, those scores are not where we would like them to be either. So I think that the whole issue of trust is one that is very much a personal issue, but it's also an organizational issue. Mm-hmm. And I know that some of what Brenda would like to talk about today is around the individual development, leadership development. A lot of the work that I do is around that as well, but more in the organizational context. How do you generate trust within an organization?
Okay, sure. So Brenda?
Well, from an individual perspective, I do a lot of coaching with individuals and with organizational teams. And what I find is that we have 3 things that are absolutely critical to a leader's success, no matter what grade the leader is or where the leader's trying to go. This is not just about I want to grow up to be an SES, but it's how do I be a great leader where I am? And 3 things: trust, credibility, and I think you used the word competence, and it's same, mm-hmm. and respect. Both giving and receiving respect is part of this whole thing with trust. I also find that the executive core competencies are so tied to both emotional intelligence and to trust. And so when you look at both of those, you'll find that you can't be a success. And executive core competencies don't mean that you have to be an SES. We're looking at these things down to the 13 level and people who are team leads and project leads. So trust is going to fall into all of these categories for us.
Well, you know, interesting, because one of the things we always talk about is the fact that we use the word leader in a way that's not right. We use the word leader as if that's only the person on the top of the pyramid. And what sometimes people really need to understand is it's not necessarily the person on the top of the pyramid is the leader, that person's the manager certainly, but leadership is at all levels.
Absolutely.
And so all of the things that we're talking about here applies really to everyone at every level. Because if you, as my understanding of trust is that intersection between character and competence. And if you're lacking any one of those things, or either one of those things at any level, you are not going to be garnering the trust of anyone.
Absolutely.
So I think, you know, we sort of have to set those big parameters around, this is a conversation for everybody. No matter what level you're in the organization, whether you're coming in, you know, at the GS5 or whether you're an SES. I mean, that trust just permeates the entire organization.
It does. And I think we can see that one of the elements of trust is about how much risk people are allowed to take and how well they're supported.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, to your point, Melanie, about the personal aspects of trust, you think about every day, not just in the work setting, life in general. Any kind of relationship that one has with another party, another person,
Right.
is about whether you're practicing trustworthy behavior or you're not. So it is very much an individual thing. You cannot change an organization's trust level without individuals adjusting their own. If they're not trustworthy, the only way an organization overall, because we sometimes think of organizational trust as sort of an amorphous kind of thing, but it's based on all the individuals that are within that organization, all the touch points that those people have outside the organization.
Right.
So when you think of federal agencies, think of all the touch points that there are. All the, you know, the clients, the customers, the people that are being serviced, the public. I mean, if people don't believe in what you're doing and don't believe that you're trustworthy, why would they ever want to come to you? Why would they ever contact you? Why would they
Right.
feel that there's any sense of desire to have a relationship? So I think that's the key element. That's a key part of all of this.
Right. I agree with you completely. I mean, I think it's sort of built on a pyramid of behavior, interpersonal, and then organizational. Because if you don't have that bottom level of the behaviors, you're not going to have any sort of interpersonal trust, which is on a reciprocal sort of basis, right? And then you're not going to have the greater organizational trust.
And I think sometimes we do a disservice by talking about, when we talk about leaders, people normally think of leaders in an organization at a certain level and above.
Right.
But again, to your point, we are all leaders in one form or another. We're leaders of our
Exactly.
own lives, right?
Right.
So if we practice leadership, no matter what level we are within an organization, I think that will show. Okay? And then maybe, hopefully, people will emulate those kinds of behaviors across the board. So.
Right. Okay. I think I'm pulling you away a little bit from your slides, but
Oh,
that's
that's fine.
okay. You know, if you want to, you have. I know you have other definitions and things you want to talk about.
Well, there are, in addition to, we talked a little bit about the Edelman Index, but also, you know, I won't go through this in detail, but we all are very well aware of the different types of scandals and things that have occurred within the federal government. There are also, you could have a list that's just as long, if not longer, for the business sector
Absolutely.
of the world as well.
Absolutely.
But these are just some
No one's
examples.
immune.
Yeah, no
In
one is
other wo-
immune.
in
No
other
one is
words.
immune from it. Exactly. There is something that's referred to, and this actually comes from Trust Across America, which is an organization that is striving to ensure that trustworthy behavior and leadership is demonstrated in organizations. It's actually called Trust Across America. It started here in the United States, but it's taken on such value for so many people. It's now called Trust Across America, Trust Around the World. So there are people from all around the world now
Excellent.
engaging in this conversation. And if you look at the literature, if you go back and do a study of the literature over the last 5 to 10 years, you'll see it used not to be, trust wasn't really talked about a whole lot, not in the research literature. Now it's being talked about a lot. And there are hard costs of low trust. So some of those are presented here. Gallup's 2011 research places 71% of U.S. workers as either not engaged or actively disengaged.
Okay.
And part of that is related to the fact that people don't feel that they can trust others within their organization or trust their organization as a whole. Okay, so there are effects, there are hard costs to low trust. People say, yeah, it's a good thing to do to be trustworthy, but where's the business case? Well, these statistics that we're showing here on the screen here are evidence of that, okay? And I think senior leaders of organizations need to recognize that and say, yes, it does make a difference, and in fact, probably their own performance and what they receive in their own compensation should be based on how well they're perceived in terms of the trustworthy behavior.
So that's interesting. So there's actually almost as if there's a return on investment for high trust.
Exactly.
Right? There could be a dollar cost associated because, and maybe you get into this a little bit, Brenda, because if you're in an organization where people don't really trust each other, you're sort of spending a lot of time worrying about that and doing other things where you can actually, I think, could be more productive if you were in a more open environment. Is that the case?
It is the case, and I can give some hard examples of this. I've had to run reductions in force and base closures and transfer of functions and other kinds of things. And I can tell you that when we're in major change, there's nothing more important than a level of trust. And I've said to the commanders I worked for at the time, communication, 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 being transparent. When you're looking for employee engagement, when they're going through major crisis, if you haven't supported them well, they forget all about the mission and what's going on, and all they're focused on is how are they going to take care of themselves, their family, what's happening next, what's happening to their coworkers. So you can see how trust plays out in the everyday work environment, and then two places where we can really see whether an organization is following through in actions on trust. When we have either crisis like Katrina, and I could give a lot of examples of how that worked well and not with agencies that didn't allow their employees to take risk, and then when we have things like base closures. I can give a few examples of where people really did a great job. I know years ago, Customs and Border, when they moved the academy out west, they did some things that really established great trust. I use it as examples in my classes all the time. And I watched what DISA did when they moved recently to Fort Meade. And it was all about transparency. It was all about setting the stage. It was all about taking care of their staff. When people have that level of trust, then they will follow you wherever you're going. As one of my clients said once, they followed me into the unknown. It sounded like Star Trek. But it's true. Trust under change is absolutely where you see when we succeed or fail.
And that goes hand in hand with leadership.
It does.
You know, hand in hand with leadership, because I always think of a leader as someone that you would follow when you don't have to. And so if a manager would be someone that you would have to follow, right? So if you have this high levels of trust, then you're willing to take that risk and follow that person because you know that they're going to lead into a good place.
Right.
Right? And they're not going to harm you in any way.
And without that level of trust, when there's the unknown, then they don't want to do that. And that's where we have the problem. And we won't get people engaged when they don't have trust in their leadership, when they're undergoing major change.
Right. So many times when there's distrust, people question the intentions of leaders.
Right.
What do the leaders really mean when they've just communicated made some announcement, major announcement? Does the workforce typically, do they believe it? Do they believe the reasons behind it? How it's being explained? One of the things that I find very interesting, and I'm going to show this other slide here, in terms of what the polls say. And I find this really interesting. It's not just about the federal government, it's not just about business, it's not about the work world, but basically Americans don't trust one another anymore. At least, I mean, we do, but basically what the data is showing, we're trusting one another less and less, just in terms of our personal relationships, right? So trust has declined as the gap between the nation's rich and poor grows ever larger. Many social scientists blame 24-hour news coverage for some of this because there's so much news and it's so immediate, and people will draw their own conclusions from what they're hearing. The data shows that only 1/3 of Americans say they trust others. It's a record low from 1972.
Wow.
Think about that. Think about the impact that has on our society in general.
That's terrible.
Not just in the workforce, but just overall, right?
Right.
1972 was the first year for this particular survey, and distrust may be, as we note here, may breed corruption, and which social scientists are warning against. So it's a more insidious kind of issue than just what's happening within organizations. It's what's happening within our own lives. How do we demonstrate those trustworthy behaviors in our relationships with one another?
Well,
that's the key. And if people start doing more of that, not that we're not doing it, we do it, but if we start doing more of that and we're holding ourselves accountable for that, then I think naturally we're going to see the kind of change that I think we're looking for.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that then. How do you begin to start demonstrating those behaviors? What do you need to do?
Well, there are certain things that I think are pretty common that we can do. One is speaking openly and freely with another person if you have a disagreement about something. In work settings many times, people don't speak up. They have all these unspoken conversations going on in their heads. They want to say things, but they don't say things.
Or after the meeting is over.
Or after the meeting is over.
This is what happens a lot, is that people will be in agreement in the meeting, but what they do is immediately following the meeting is when all the grumbling begins.
Managers, leaders, senior leaders have a key role to play because they help set the tone for an organization or a team. So if you have a team leader, for example, who is constantly directing everything on the team, not allowing people to speak up, voice their opinions, if it's more of a directive kind of role that the leader plays, why would people want to speak up? Why would they want to put themselves on the hot seat for something they're recommending that's going to get turned down immediately? So those types of things do happen. And the other thing that I've noticed quite a bit about in terms of leaderships, and not all leaders, because we have very good leaders in both business and government, but some, their ego is so strong that they can't accept the fact that they don't know everything.
Right.
Right?
You see that a lot.
And that's an unfortunate
everywhere.
it's an
You see that
unfortunate
everywhere.
phenomenon, but that's there. I think that if you're really an effective leader, you're going to be listening, you're going to be engaging, you're going to be doing all the things to try to engage the people that you work with.
And some of those issues you talked about, though, have to do with confidence, have to do with self-esteem. I mean, there's a lot of things involved there because sometimes people are at a certain level and they're nervous. They're at that level and they're kind of nervous. They're, well, now, wow, I got to this level and, I don't know everything. I know I don't know everything, but I have to convey as if I do. And so that also plays into this, I think, too, doesn't it?
I think I do a session, I've done this with about 5,000 executives, and I do something called leadership, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And in this role, you can look at the ones in the middle are just our sort of our leadership neuroses and the things that we're not really good at. But when we look at the extremes and what leaders have said, and these are all 13s through SESers that I've run through this exercise, they all have all these things that the ugly leaders do. And it's back to your thing, Melanie, it's about character and credibility. Because if you don't know what you're talking about and you can't ask the right questions, no one's going to trust you. Then it goes into the integrity side, and it's whether or not people are doing things that are really showing in actions, Bill, whether they can have trustworthy behaviors. And this part about, I hear the words intimidation, criticism in public, can't talk, they won't listen.
Right.
And then when I look at the good side, there's words that come up like humble. They're good communicators. They share with their staff. They're not insecure. They're comfortable in their own skin. So all of these things build trust. So when you look at the good and you look at the really ugly, you can see how trust is the major factor that plays out in both of those.
From my experience, what's a bit ironic is the fact that if a leader shows that he or she is vulnerable and doesn't really necessarily have all the answers, most people will accept that as the truth. They will accept that as, I can understand that because if I were in your position, I probably wouldn't have all the answers either.
Right.
So it makes them more real. They're more approachable. They are not, you're not living in a sort of a world or an environment of, and you've heard me use this term before, cordial hypocrisy, where people are talking to one another in teams and large sessions and so forth in a nice way, but they're saying things about that person behind their back.
Right.
Afterwards. After the meetings, like we were talking about before, right? So how do we eliminate that cordial hypocrisy? We make the trust truly real. That's the key
And then
for leaders to think about.
that's a great point. How do you do that?
Well, I think there's a whole list of trustworthy behaviors that I know
You've
Brenda
got a list
has.
of
I've
them.
got. I mean, I have through my own business, a survey process for leadership teams and also for organizations that actually takes behavioral indicators and actually measures those in the survey process. So it's in it, and we also have a self-assessment tool that you can use, and you can sort of check yourself against.
Okay, so what can we do, though, for the people watching now? So the people watching now, they may be in environments where the trust level isn't at the maximum, okay? So what can they do today to think about, how do I handle the situation that I'm in? What can they take away from and think, okay, what's a good technique that I can use? Because maybe what I am doing is I'm spending a lot of time spinning because I don't necessarily trust the people, my manager, I don't trust the people I'm with, and it's taking away from me being a more productive employee. How can I change that?
Well, you can't control what other people do or don't do, but you can control to a certain degree what you do.
Right.
Right? So, for example, when you make a commitment to someone, you put a deadline on it, a time frame, whether it's to another person, whether it's to a team, if you're part of a team on a team project, honor that commitment. Don't let it slip. Make sure that you follow through. And if you can't follow through on the time frame that you've identified, then let that person or those parties know with a sufficient amount of time in advance, if you can, that something else has come up with a higher priority that you have to address, right? But making and keeping commitments is a huge part of this.
Well, I guess then you talk about overpromising. There's a lot of overpromising that goes on. Sometimes you really can't hit a deadline, but you're afraid maybe to say,
Right.
I can't do it. I can't make it then, but I can make it 2 weeks from then. So what you're talking about is really a lot of frank discussions that need to go on, right?
Yes.
Is that it?
Yes, it is. It very much is. And I think people, the more you can cultivate that with the people that you work with, the better off you're going to be, and the whole team is going to be. I think that many times there's a reluctance to say no or to commit, meaning you're not going to commit to do it when they have asked for it, but you can commit to do it a week later or maybe 2 weeks later. Is almost a sense that we don't have the wherewithal, if you will, to negotiate where we have to negotiate, right? In order to cover all the commitments that we do have as
Right.
individuals. And I think that's important to do that. People don't want to tell senior leaders or their managers, if you will, no, I can't do it.
Right.
So they just put it on their plate, and then when they don't get it done, then the manager or leader doesn't trust them to do it next time, do it well, right?
It's
So-
back to speaking truth to power. And
Yeah.
it's really hard sometimes to speak truth to power, to say, no, I can't, no, this is not good. Maybe we need to take a different approach. I have 3 other priorities. What would you like me to do about that? And then on the
Right.
other side, we have managers, it's not speaking truth to power, it's speaking truth to their employees. And this is back to this frank and honest discussions again, Melanie. And one of the things that happens is people will not tell people that they're not the right fit where they are, or that they have great skills, or they have great strengths, but it's not the strengths that's needed for this position. People need to have these frank discussions, and that comes back to my word respect. You need to respect the other person enough to tell them the truth.
Right.
Right.
And then that starts building trust.
Well, there are, and maybe we jump ahead a little bit on terms of distinctions of trust that I mentioned
sure.
a little bit earlier, but there are things about how do you demonstrate that you care about another person, okay? What are the behaviors, the actions that you take, not just, behaviors talking about them in general, but what are the actions that you're taking to demonstrate you care for other people, okay? And your sincerity, okay? That you really mean what you say. It's not just a lot of double talk, right? What do you do? We talked already about commitments, all right, and about how we keep those. Are we also practicing behaviors whereby if we have something to say about another person and they're part of our team, or even if they're not part of our team, are we speaking about them outside of quarters, so to speak, in terms of not the most positive way? If we have an issue with somebody, why is it so difficult for us to go and approach that person and say, do you have a few minutes so we could sit down and talk?
Right.
Let's go get a cup of coffee. It's something that's occurred. I wanted talk with you about it. I'm sure I don't have all the facts or details about what happened, but this is how it came across, how it's maybe directly affecting me or my team. So let's talk about it. And I find typically when people do that, and it's not that it's maybe hard to do in your mind, but once you've done it,
right,
it's there, right?
Right.
So I just think that we need to do more of that. We need to have more of those kinds of conversations.
Right. This whole topic is very interesting to me. I haven't done a lot of research on it, but I've thought a lot about it. And as I think about it, I was thinking about it in terms of what had been going on in terms of college football, which is maybe an odd analogy, but nonetheless. So I was thinking that in football, when the quarterback throws a pass to somebody and that receiver drops it, the receiver drops it, he goes off to the sideline, but the coach, the quarterback, the rest of the team goes in there to talk to that guy and say, you know what, we need you. We really need you. You got to get back in there. We trust that you're going to do it right the next time. Right. And you know what? The next pass goes back to that guy, and he catches it. But in organizations sometimes, when someone drops the ball on something because they don't meet a deadline or something happens, they don't go back to that person anymore. They're sort of damaged in a way, sort of whatever damaged is, but they're not looked at the same. And so I think there also trust is sometimes broken.
I talk to agencies about managing what I call your A, B, and C performers. And this is an example of that. And I'll say, do you have C performers? They said, absolutely, we have C performers. And I'm going, well, how do your C performers know they're not A performers? And the answer always is, well, I can't give them the high work because if they fail, it's going to be really bad for us. And I'm going, but you have to give them an opportunity to try, and you have to work with them, and don't make every failure a fatal career flaw, or you're going to get people that won't do anything. And it's back again. They won't trust. And the C performers never know that they're not A performers because they've never been given a stretch assignment and an opportunity to try.
Right.
And then to be supported if it doesn't work well. So leaders need to learn how to do a level of risk and manage that risk successfully so that people still feel supported as they're trying to grow. And that's one of our biggies, I think, that we don't do well.
Right, right, okay.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like, again, I've gotten you away from your main points, but I think it's been a good conversation. I think that, we've gotten a lot of issues out, so.
Did you want to?
Oh, I was just going to sort of jump through these a little bit to get to some of your materials around ECQs. So.
All right. We can talk a little bit about ECQs, executive core competencies. I think people sometimes have an impression that these are made for people who want to be an SES. And in my world, executive competencies should be geared down to journeyman level work. And this is where people start building their leadership skills. And this is where things begin to start happening and we start developing others. And if you look at ECQs, you will find that ECQs are all about relationships. And it's not just about leaders who are SESers, it's about everybody that works on a team. And how do you lead from where you are? So these competencies also track really closely, I've discovered, to emotional intelligence. So I also teach a course on emotional intelligence and political savvy, and with a small p. And I'll say you can't do one without the other. People think that if they do their job, they're going to be fine. It's not just about technical competence. Leaders have to do other things. And they have to build relationships. They have to be accountable, as you say. Show up, be there, do what you said you were going to do. And if you don't build that level of trust, you have poor relationships, you get poor outcomes. One of my favorite new books that I haven't finished is by Adam Grant from Wharton on give and take. And this is about how we help others. And by helping others, we help ourselves and we help our organization. And I think too many people have a myopic view and they look down in their organization and they try to produce really good products when they really need to be building relationships. So,
you know, it's interesting you're talking about helping others. When you think about helping others to succeed in an organization, if you're a leader, or even if you're not, if you just, you know, maybe you're not designated as a leader, but we said everybody has a leadership role to a certain degree. How we help others to succeed, it's not just about our own success, but it's what are the things that we're doing. Maybe we're working on a project that has a high visibility, high profile, But we have so many other commitments that we're working on too. You know, we say, well, how about Joe or Sue? Can you take this on, right, to do this? And I know in the process of doing that, by handing that over to you, if management's okay with that, that you'll get a lot of visibility. But it's okay to share in the visibility. It's okay to share in the success.
okay to share.
You know,
and that's such a key point. It doesn't take anything away from you by letting somebody else shine.
Right.
That's really the key point. You don't see that every day, but you see that in pockets.
There's a tendency to like sometimes people tend to think that because knowledge is power, so if they can consolidate that knowledge for themselves or their team, immediate team, that they're going to be able to control outcomes.
Right.
Well, why not share the power? Why not share the information, if you will? If it is power, why not share it, right?
Right. Knowledge is power is actually a very, very old thought. I mean, really the idea is, you know, if knowledge is power, it's just me that knows it. But, you know, if I walk into a room and have an idea, and you walk into a room and have an idea, and you walk into a room and have an idea, and we share those ideas, we don't just have 3 ideas then, we could have 10 ideas.
Exactly.
And that's really the new thinking about collaborating. It's not one person's knowledge and I'm the king or queen of that piece of knowledge. It's about sharing and actually transforming that knowledge.
Yes, I agree. I think the internet's had a lot to do with that too.
When I'm coaching executives, one of the things that I have the hardest time with is exactly what you are talking about, is everything that's happened to them up to a certain point in their career is because they've been the expert. They have the knowledge. I'm the go-to person. And they think their knowledge is power. And all of a sudden, I want them to switch. And there's another book out there, Survival is Savvy. But anyway, it's called Switching from the Power of Ideas, having the knowledge, to the power of person, who you know, not what you know. And when people can't make that shift, they will never become an executive, because they have to let go of having all the knowledge, and they have to learn how to share with others. What we found in, Bill, I think we've got that slide up. That's good. That's it. Yeah. Because we know that we have a very smart government. We have lots of people who are well educated and are very smart. And then you say, how do you tell the difference between one and the other? And it comes down to emotional intelligence. How well do they play with others? If you flip that other slide, it's sort of my, the next one. Yeah. This is sort of my thing. I talk about how you build relationships. And the first thing that leaders have to know, it's not about you anymore. It's never about you anymore. It's only how you get things done through others, how you get things done through your staff, how you help your senior leaders meet their vision and their priorities, how you help your peers do better, Adam Grant's thought, and how your stakeholders can trust you to deliver. And so you're sitting there in the middle, and no matter what you do, you have to build trust, credibility, and respect, and be able to give it and get it with those 4 areas, or you're not going to ever succeed as a leader. And you're never going to build an organization that has an environment where people believe that they can succeed and that they have long-term goals. Most of the time, when we don't follow this, we end up with short-term projects. People succeeded in a project, but the organization is damaged, or they've wounded them from lack of trust. They've damaged them because they didn't share in the successes, or they were beaten up because of the failures. So leaders really have to worry about long-term goals and building an organization that can stand on its own without them.
Exactly, and
I'll get off my soapbox.
Well,
no, that's really an excellent point, you know, because you're right. People have, because of their technical skills, they generally work their way to a certain position. But along that way, sometimes they have not been able to really get those people skills that are really necessary, and understand that, you know, no one's an island. Right. And that's kind of the thought that needs to, I think, come across, is that, you know, at certain levels, you're dependent upon the success of others. Absolutely. And if those people don't believe in you, and they don't see you have a vision, and they don't see the qualities that they're looking for, they'll do what's needed, but no more.
No more.
And so, you know, we don't want to be in situations like that.
No.
And as leaders, we're constantly being watched, right? Leaders are always being watched by the people that work with them. So even though you may have a great track record around trust and doing all the things that we're talking about with your team and with others, if you drop down from that at any point along the way, it's going to be noticed, particularly noticed, because that's going to, oh, that's not characteristic of so-and-so, right? All right? So it's something that we constantly have to be sort of vigilant about, not to be worried about it, but to be asking ourselves, what did we do today? What did we do this week? What did we do this month to help inculcate trustworthy behavior, so people see that coming from my own leadership, but also from our collective leadership.
Right.
You know?
I can't agree with you more. I don't think people realize that they're being watched all the time by other people. I don't think, I mean, I can give you a personal example. So I came into the government right from college at a pretty low grade. And I remember thinking, you know, I wanted to attain something more, and so I would look at the people who were graded higher than me. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, if I'm a 4, a 7 is pretty high. Yeah. You know, a 9 is pretty high, and so, you know, I don't think people sort of get that they're role models, and I think that's a big piece of it. I mean, you can be a role model at any grade, mm-hmm. because it's really your character and your competence is what people look to you for.
Right.
More than anything else.
Right.
And so you can emulate and you can have those two things going for you no matter where you are in the organization. You can have that going for you when you come in, when you're a college intern. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it's really important that people realize, and that's what builds trust along the way, because you've shown those kind of capabilities.
Exactly.
And I think that people don't realize how much they're looked at. I had one senior mm-hmm. leader once that told me that she had a stomachache and went into the cafeteria and ordered something light, and someone said she didn't like her new boss and was going to be leaving. You know, so rumors just really, really travel
right.
quickly. But when we look at how we manage our expectations, I ask senior leaders, what are your values and priorities, and how do your actions show that you are modeling those values and priorities? Mm-hmm. And many times when I do this exercise, people say they don't walk their talk. Mm-hmm. They're not living their world, they're not doing what they say they're doing, and they're not being consistent. And sometimes with trust, sometimes people would rather have an ugly leader that's at least consistent than one who is not always doing the same thing. And so that's when mm-hmm. the level of trust. Have you ever seen organizations where people are so off balance all the time because they're not sure what's going to happen next?
Exactly.
And that's also a real level of trust.
It's funny, the research actually on that, some of that I've read about, it talks about employees would prefer to have a boss or leader who is consistently bad, mm-hmm. rather than bad sometimes and good sometimes mm-hmm. and in between sometimes, because they never know what to expect. Right?
And it's the uncertainty.
That's the irony mm-hmm. behind that, right? But people need consistency in their leadership. They need consistency to know what the expectations are, what the intentions mm-hmm. are, and then they are able to then work with that to deliver whatever they have to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they need that consistency. Yeah. They need to know what to expect. And when people don't know what to expect, they will have no level of trust. Mm-hmm. When I talk about individuals building trust, people talk about advancing in their careers. And I was just helping with a mentoring program that a group had piloted. And one of the things I was so pleased about is the SES mentors had helped people build better relationships within their current organizations. It wasn't just about mm-hmm. getting to the next level. Mm-hmm. It's about how do you do well where you are? And that's where I think we all need to think about is how do we do well where we are? And one of it is to show genuine concern for others. Sharing in difficult assignments. How are you helping your peers do better? How is the work that you're doing being modeled elsewhere? Mm-hmm. How can you show that you are helping your organization by doing things like Melanie does here with things like this?
Thank you.
So it's about how you improve your organization from wherever you sit. And then sometimes people don't understand that their actions speak much louder than words, and trust is built upon actions and not on thoughts or not on you know, these wonderful little things we stick on the wall that we say that we really believe in. But if they don't really see it happening, then they're not going to believe it. And then the last thing is use power wisely and don't use it against people. And also to know when you have power and use it well, because sometimes you're insecure and you say, wow, I didn't think I was ever going to get here and now I am. What do I do with this?
Right.
And the thing is to accept that role that you have, be humble and know that you don't have all the answers, and understand it's never about you anymore.
Right. I would also suggest, and this is something I do typically with my coaching clients as well, think about who your own, if you had a board of directors, you're your own company, okay? Company of one person, right?
That's me.
Right?
Right.
And you have a board of, say you have a board of directors or you want to have one. And this is not a board that would typically meet, once a month and that kind of thing, and everybody come together. But these are people that you trust, that you have respect in, and that you feel have the same with you. People that you can go to and you can actually ask, how am I doing? What have you observed? What have you seen? I don't know too many people that actually think of it in sort of in that context, and you can probably count on maybe even one hand those people who would be on your personal board of directors, all right?
I agree.
That's a great concept,
But am I
actually.
practicing trustworthy leadership? What are you seeing in the interactions I have with you and what you can observe and what I'm having in interactions with others? What do you see, right? Because we have so many blind spots that we don't realize. Different people will interpret things differently, right? They'll interpret different intentions, thoughts, whatever. But if these are people that you really know you're going to get good feedback from, they're not going to hold back, they're going to tell you the truth, think about who would those people be and what would you ask them?
Yeah.
So
I have a little
that's really
chart
interesting.
for that.
Oh, do you have a chart on?
I do.
you
I
have-
don't have it on the screen.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
But yeah, about being a seat. But one of the things that I think that people need to do is understand what the buzz is out there about you. How
Right.
well do I play in this group? Do they see me as aggressive, assertive, or a contributor? And by having this board of directors, you can get some of that feedback. We find that people often, our worst leaders are those that have no self-awareness. They don't understand what they're not doing well or how other people are perceiving them.
Right.
And having this board of directors will do a great deal to help people do that. I also have a couple self-assessment tools, and one of them is you can sort of get an idea how well you're doing by asking yourself a few basic questions. Am I invited to the decision table? Do I have a voice? Do people seek me out? Do they trust my opinion and they want to see what I have to say? Are people sharing things with me? Do they invite me to participate on teams? So if you look at how you're working within the organization, if you see any of these things not happening for you, then you have to go back and do a deeper assessment of why you're not building that level of trust.
Right.
That's very interesting. So in some ways, you have to be pretty astute about your own being, right? So, and most people, I'm not sure, are.
No,
Well,
you have to
well,
work at that. It's
yeah.
not something that comes naturally.
Right. I'm not sure most people are.
Well,
And-
with 360 feedback, and there are all different types of 360 instruments out there, of course.
Right.
And OPM has its own 360 leadership tool. I found it interesting so many times when you're meeting with individuals. Let's say you're doing a coaching session or facilitating the discussion of their own personal feedback. They are so surprised at what's showing up, particularly if it's not in a positive context.
how they're viewed by the
Yeah.
others.
And what's also interesting, the phenomenon is that people that typically score the highest, have the most positive responses, are the ones who are surprised that they're that high.
That's interesting.
I agree. I've seen exactly the same thing.
It's
Yes.
a really sort of an interesting phenomenon, to say the least, because these are people who are always, I think basically it's because they're always looking for improvement. What can they do to improve? How can they create greater self-awareness, for themselves in terms of how they go about their daily activities? And so when they see that, it's like, oh wow, gosh, I didn't think they score that high. But those who score low are like, I don't know where that came from. Why did that happen? I mean, so there's not that same degree of understanding, I think.
That's
I
interesting.
think that's very true, and I've seen exactly the same thing. And I think that leaders who have teams that are not supportive of them, or they see this sort of thing and they'll say, well, that can't be my fault. It must be the fact that, so I always tell people, I'll say, it's your intent that matters. And if your intent is really to do good and people are not seeing that you're doing good, then you need to change your communication style, you need to change your approach, you need to do something. But people are trying to judge by your actions, as you said, what your intent is. So it's your job as a leader to make sure they understand what your intent is. And that takes a whole lot of communication work, and it's not easy.
Just a very simple thing that I think anybody can do, really. If you're in a supervisory role, managerial role, whatever it might be, if you make an assignment to someone, give someone an assignment, and they are not quite sure why that assignment is important, and you just give it to them, say, go do this, right? They're going to be a lot more receptive and a lot more creative and a lot more willing to do that work if you explain to them how it fits in with what else is being done. For example, if you look at an entire organization, look at the strategic objectives for an organization, all right? Agency, private business, whatever. If you can show how that work down here is supporting those key objectives at the top, people will go, I found they will go extra 100 miles if they have to make sure that that work gets done on a timely manner, in a quality manner. But they have to see the connections up. Why is this important?
Right. It's important to feel part of the mission. No matter what it is you're doing, you need to feel as if you're contributing to the mission of your organization in some way.
Right.
And then once you can see that thread going from your job to the mission, you understand how important you are in the organization. Because if you don't do what you need to do, something is not going to happen.
Right. You may be the only one doing that.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
NASA does a really good job at that. And one time I had a client that said, was working on safety for the shuttle crew, and it said the crew member's family came up and thanked me for making their family safer. But when people can see a direct relationship of how their job makes a difference, what they do, and the other thing that we need to talk about, and is back to this, is about outcomes versus outputs. Everybody knows that they contribute products, but what do they do that really makes a difference? And I think that becomes a really important key in getting engagement and trust. Show them why this is important, tell them why they're doing it. A really good book for you folks that I teach a class on is on Seeing Systems, and it's about making sure that the bottoms understand why they're doing the things that they're doing and why they think you're so dumb. If you read this book, it'll help explain all of that. I love it.
You mentioned NASA, and just really quickly, I'll share a quick story. I heard from another consultant colleague who was actually doing some work and was working late one evening at NASA headquarters, and as this person was leaving the building, saw a gentleman who was cleaning the floors, polishing the floors, and so he stopped over just to ask him a quick question. He said, well, I'm so-and-so, and I'm here doing some work. He said, what can you tell me about NASA, about your organization? And he says, what is it? Why is it that you do what you do? And he said, well, what I do supports sending a man to the moon. Now, this goes back many years ago, right? But it's like from that level all the way up, that there was a recognition on that person's part, that employee, that they are contributing, he or she was contributing to the overall mission.
Right.
Yeah.
And
That's
which was remarkable, I thought.
I've heard stories like that before. I think I heard a story like that one time at a car manufacturer, where you walked into the accounting office and the people in there were wearing baseball hats that say, I build cars. And so what they were doing in accounting to make sure that I'm going to show my lack of knowledge of accounting, but what they were doing in accounting, they felt that they were contributing to the actual manufacture of the car. To make sure that the bills were paid, to make sure people got paid, to make sure things got done, to make sure the resources were there. So everybody, no matter where they are, support, program, you need to feel like you're contributing. And I think that's really key. But I also think that comes from the leadership, so to speak, needs to make you feel like you're part of the mission. And that, again, goes back to trust.
Yeah. I think some of the more successful leaders that I've seen are those who relate to every single level in the organization.
I agree.
Right.
They're not focusing just on their cadre at the top or the mid-management group or whatever. They walk into the cafeteria, they can speak with any employee. They can walk into any room, any situation, and there's an immediate connection with all employees.
Right.
That's what we need in leadership today.
You know, when I do that good, bad, and ugly, one of the things that comes out of that always in the ugly side is we have these ugly leaders and they'll say, well, they manage up, but then they damage us on the way down. And what it always, and we have discussions around this, and what always shows is that the leadership at the top is not aware that those ugly leaders are exhibiting those ugly behaviors because they don't see them. So that means they're never getting out in the organization and seeing what's going on. And I think that when leaders have blinded by leaders underneath them that are doing things that they should not be doing, they haven't been out in the organization enough.
Right.
They're not seeing what's really going on out there.
They really don't know their organization.
They don't know their
Yeah.
organization well.
Yeah.
Right.
And that is a problem, again, with trust, because they'll say, no one's ever going to know that I'm being mistreated.
Exactly.
No one's ever going to know I did a good job, because they're not going to tell them. So comes
Yeah.
back to that.
So let's do this. I didn't realize our hour is almost up. This has been, it's been a great conversation. I think we've got a lot of good information out. So if we could leave the audience with just a couple of tips on what they can do to either or build, gain, or restore trust in their organizations.
Well, there's something we have actually on the screen about what trust requires. So these are a lot of things we've already been talking about.
Okay.
But principled leadership, the integrity we talked about, unwavering commitment to one another, honesty in our conversations and communications and so forth. So you can see the full list, transparency and what have you. The list actually runs, this particular list runs actually 2 pages worth. So I think everyone will have access to this.
Right, everyone will get the slides.
I think a big part, so rather than go through this list in any detail, which we don't really have the time for, I think restoring trust is the tough one. We can build it, we can maintain it to a certain degree, but restoring it requires us to be willing to take additional risk. If we have been in a situation where someone has been distrustful with us and we know it for a fact, that's one thing. A lot of times people will make an assessment that someone was distrustful with us, but if we don't have a conversation with that person, we don't necessarily know all the facts, right? So approach that person, talk with them, say, I have a concern here. And it's not in the context of I distrust you as a, quote, whole person, but there's something that just took place or took place a week ago, whenever, and I'd like to have a conversation around it to find out what really took place. I mean, why did it come out the way that it came out? The other thing is not to let the issue of trust or distrust linger. When it happens, approach that person, talk with them. And I know it's not easy to do, but if you have distinctions of trust, like we talked about before, okay, care, sincerity, commitments, all those types of reliability in what you do and say, then you can break it down into those components. You might think the person trusts them to be very caring and sincere, but their reliability and meeting commitments is not, or timelines is not something they've demonstrated in their actions. So you can have a conversation around that. The other stuff is fine, right? So I think those are some of the things that we need to be attentive to.
Okay. And Brenda, what do you think?
One of the things that I have found to be such an extreme problem, and I always tell managers, it's not what you intended, it's what people perceive. So if you find that there's buzzes going on out there about something you've done, a selection you've made, other kinds of leadership actions that you've taken, and you think that people are dissatisfied with it or they don't understand, you need to do something that brings some transparency to this, because your biggest problems come from complaints that are filed about what people perceive that's happened rather than what actually happened. So trying to get dialogue, trying to actually have meetings around it, trying to explain your behaviors in a way that everybody can understand as long as you're not violating anyone's privacy. Transparency is absolutely key to building trust. So everything that you can do to show the logic behind why you did it is going to build trust.
I think it all boils down to accountability, personal accountability and accountability with others. If we're not held accountable, what difference does it make?
Right.
Really?
Well, and I think that that's probably a great way to end it, talking about accountability. I mean, and ending it with accountability, because that's really, you're right, that's really what it gets down to in the end. So with that, I would like to thank you both, Bill and Brenda, for being with us today. I think we've had a great discussion on trust. I hope that the audience has learned a lot. And I would just ask you to join us again in February, on February 19th, for our next HUD OCIO learning session, which is going to be focused on action learning. And what action learning is essentially experiential learning and how you continue to learn and grow from each experience. So thank you very much for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.